That's the $300 billion question. While everyone was engrossed in the $61 billion in aid to Ukraine, Congress quietly made a more intriguing move. Not in the Ukraine Act, not in the Israel Act, or the Taiwan Act, but in a vague comprehensive fourth bill covering so much that it was easier for the media to ignore the details. Full disclosure, I'm guilty of this too. Excuse me. But the crux of the matter is the seizure of some $300 billion in Russian assets controlled by Western governments. It's a touchy subject with serious implications for the war. Most of my viewers, according to a super scientific poll, support it. But whether you're in the majority or minority, whether you call it a seizure, confiscation, preemptive reparations, or special banking operation, both sides often miss some of the subtleties of the seizure or lack thereof. Welcome to the paradoxical world, where capture will simultaneously cause greater global instability and be a force for greater global stability. For those of us who have experienced this logical migraine, today we will look at what these frozen assets are, what caused them, and how. What the congressional bill does to bring this pile of money into play. The problems that will arise from Russia's possible response to this seizure. What it will do to the international financial system as a whole. Why the West will gain a hidden benefit by reducing the safety to foreign investment. And lastly, we'll save the best for last, a discussion of the lines on the maps and how the seizure undermines one of the West's key objectives in this war. But let's start with the asset basics. Let's look back a decade ago when Russia first entered and then annexed Crimea. The West responded with what could be called light sanctions by today's standards. Nevertheless, it was enough to cause a noticeable financial crisis in Russia. Not enough to undermine Putin's position in the Kremlin, but enough to devalue the ruble from 36 to the dollar on the day of annexation to 61 rubles by the end of 2014. Hence the so-called Fortress Russia strategy, the Kremlin's policy of creating a rainy day fund in rubles and generally insulating the Russian economy from Western sanctions. The key consequence of this for us is that Russia's central bank has accumulated $600 billion in savings by the time the invasion of Ukraine begins in February 2022. Oddly, about half of that money was in Western accounts. This may seem odd, given that the goal was to isolate Moscow from foreign coercion. Still, the Western financial system is too widely spread, and it's hard to place $600 billion without parking a significant portion of it there. Perhaps some of the money could have been withdrawn on the eve of the invasion. But remember that the Kremlin was counting on a quick end to the war. The Kiev government would soon fall, and the Western sanctions campaign would not have time to take effect. I will mention that what makes my channel unique is that I can tell you what peer-reviewed international relations research says about conflicts in the modern world. But as an exception, I turned this video into a peer-reviewed article. There's a link to it in the video description and to a symposium on warfare I organized. Lots of free reading, but you don't need to take an exam, I promise. Anyway, the Kremlin's optimism turned out to be in vain. We all soon learned that it was unjustified. As a result, the Western financial system froze $300 billion. The money is still just sitting there. Russia can't get it. It's not clear exactly where the Kremlin should turn to get it though. It is not clear exactly how much of it is divided between the US and Europe. The bill mentioned suggests that the US only has $4.5 billion. Most of it is probably in Belgium, France, and Germany. However, since any further action with them is likely to be coordinated between the shores of the Atlantic, this particular point may not matter much. It is also unclear exactly how much money we are considering. There was $300 billion. But that $300 billion is not just lying in a vault. The funds are probably accumulating some interest. Even a conservative investment in one-year US Treasury bills now yields about 5% per annum. On the other hand, it's hard to remember, but interest rates were close to zero at the beginning of the war. So now we're not talking about $330 billion anymore, but definitely more than $300 billion. And that interest will become important later. Now, let's turn to the omnibus bill passed by Congress in April. Let's start with its literal content. The key difference is that the bill authorizes a shift from freezing assets to seizing them. Instead of denying Russia access to the accounts, the money would be transferred to other accounts. So Russia will never be able to reclaim the funds because they will no longer exist. The bill sets the following timetable. Within the first 90 days, the Treasury Department must find out exactly how much Russian money the United States controls and where it is located. After another 90 days, the Treasury Department must report to Congress on its findings. A month after that, the president can seize, confiscate, transfer, or appropriate the money. That brings us to November. Biden will still be president, but within 2 months it could be Trump. Regardless, whoever ends up in power will get to take Russian money and send it to Ukraine to compensate for the damage from the invasion. The bill also mandates that such measures must be taken in conjunction with the Group of Seven, the European Union, Australia, and any other parties holding Russian funds. This gives new significance to the upcoming G7 summit in Italy from June 13 to 15. On the surface, all this looks favorable to the West. But the reality is more complex. Let's look at the main concerns and analyze whether they are problematic or not. The first is the problem of Russian retaliation. This has been the main line of response from Russian state media. Basically, the US seizes things, and Russia seizes something in response as well. The difference, of course, is the significant asymmetry between the sides. It made financial sense for Russia to invest assets in the West. By contrast, Western countries did not see Russia as a good place to store dollars or euros. So Uncle Sam does not have a frozen piggy bank in Moscow that the Kremlin can simply rob in retaliation for seizing Russian assets. Consequently, the threat of retaliation is that Russia will seize the personal assets of American, British, or European citizens, according to former President Dmitry Medvedev. The complicating point here is that the affected American citizens would undoubtedly sue the US government. Yes, Washington didn't confiscate their money directly, but there is an obvious causal link where the government's actions caused the loss of funds. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to guess how this will all turn out in the end. But I can tell you that there will probably be an injunction against the seizure of frozen Russian assets. That is 2 layers of ice, and if the court sides with the private citizens, Ukraine will not get a dime until the citizens are compensated in full. The whole situation will turn into a complicated reallocation of assets, benefiting no one. The second category of problems is that the Russian government is not a good place to invest. The US and to a lesser extent the EU benefit from being the de facto custodians of the world economy. This offers a host of intangible benefits. But I'll briefly highlight one. You can borrow money denominated in your own currency. So if you're the US and you urgently need to pay off a debt, you can always literally print money for that payment. And imagine you're Argentina and you want to borrow money on the international market. Well, the lenders will offer you dollars. You take the money, and when it comes due, the lenders expect to receive the dollars in return. Consequently, if you don't have those dollars, you will have to turn to the international markets to buy dollars to pay the debt. In fact, the fact that other countries want to borrow in dollars strengthens the dollar and in turn enriches the US. Combined with the fact that US treasuries are among the safest investments, a system emerges where the US can borrow money at ridiculously low rates. That's fine when you have a national debt of $34 trillion and you can borrow money at very low rates. And in 2023, you have a deficit of $1.7 trillion. In fact, access to cheap credit is one of the main reasons those numbers exist. In terms of Russian asset seizures, there's a serious concern here about other foreign governments. Normally, they would want to keep some of their money in Western institutions, but now they may fear that their assets could also be seized. Then they will get out of US treasuries and suddenly interest rates for Washington will soar. There are fears that this is already happening to China. On the eve of the invasion, China held just over $1 trillion in US treasuries. Now it is left with $775 billion. Clearly, Beijing began selling off government bonds even before the war. The process began in 2018, when the maximum amount China held was $1.2 trillion. But after the tanks crossed the border, the pace accelerated. And overall, this could lead to a weaker dollar, which is bad for the US economy. You may have heard some version of this argument before, but we should take a moment to analyze why this is not a net negative for the West. Imagine a spectrum of countries according to the likelihood of their questionable actions from a collective Western perspective. At one end is Canada, where I was once threatened with a beating, and then a friend added that they should do it politely. Real story. And at the other end is, say, North Korea. Everyone on that end isn't thinking about Western investment, and everyone on the other end is already too scared to show their finances. Let's outline them for further analysis. Those countries closer to the dangerous end of the spectrum will be frightened by the seizure of Russian assets and will withdraw their funds from the Western system. And those closer to the safe end will disapprove of what is happening, but they are still unlikely to incur the wrath of the West, so they will stay in the system. In total, we have 4 groups of countries. The question beyond the competence of us keyboard experts is how far down the line the division between the 2 middle groups will be. How widely will they be divided? If the water runs closer to the safe end, the takeover precedent will have almost no effect on the world economic structure. If it moves toward the dangerous end, then Washington will have to fear that a large enough part of the world will want an alternative system that China will be highly incentivized to invest in its creation. And as a result, the West would lose the relatively soft leverage of coercion through asset freezes the next time something like this happens. But there is another important factor here. All the discussion is about the precedent that an asset seizure would set and how it would affect the thinking of these countries. Much less attention is paid to the precedent that will be set by the rejection of asset seizures and how that will affect the thinking of these countries. Think about those middle countries that will remain in the system despite complaints about US overreach. Take as an odd example a sort of version of Ireland obsessed with dyeing America's precious bodies of water green. In the past, when the opportunity to get out of control came up, they didn't see it as a big negative. So what if everything turns green? But move to the post-asset seizure world, and there's a huge fat downside to their calculations. Because their assets will be seized too. So they just give up on the idea of getting out of control to begin with. And Americans can drink the water in peace. So the Western powers lose leverage over this group, but increase their influence over this group. I'll leave it to the experts to decide which matters more. Finally, we come to the main event of the evening. Get ready to get excited, because it's time for the lines on the cards. Tonight's focus is the single cost problem, and this is where the game gets tricky. Let's break down the rules and see who can win. I mean costs that a country can only incur once, and that do not reset over time. For example, an attack on an oil refinery is not a one-time cost because Russia can repair the damage and Ukraine can do the damage again. An asset seizure, on the other hand, would be a one-time cost. The basic problem is this. You have the standard white line indicating the hypothetical expected territorial outcome of the war should it continue to a military conclusion. And then you have Russia's red line with the gap between the two reflecting Moscow's costs of the war. If you want Russia to retreat at least to the January 2022 borders under the terms of a final settlement of this war, then you need to push the red line back somewhere here. This is accomplished either by arming Ukraine to the teeth so that the expected outcome of the war is very favorable to Kyiv, or by imposing such costs on Russia that even a territorial outcome favorable to Moscow is still a big net negative. The problem with any one-time cost is that you can only impose it once. And if Western countries do this, they will impose them once. And if they do it now, they can't do it again later. Moreover, it's hard to imagine that any seizure of assets could be reversed, since the money would already be redistributed. Thus, once seized, it will no longer be a cost of war. It will simply become a fact of life, regardless of Russia's future decisions regarding war and peace. But it means that the cost to Russia of continuing the war to a military outcome will decrease. And that means that the red line will actually move deeper into Ukrainian territory. As a result, for the purposes of pushing back the red line, it is better to maintain the threat of asset seizure than to actually do so, at least until the military outcome of the war is realized. This is why the West froze these assets in the first place. They create bargaining leverage. Admittedly, the divergence between the West and Ukraine on this issue is interesting. Ukraine is all in favor of asset seizure despite the red line shift issue. The reason is that even if the red line shifts unfavorably, Kyiv will still get a fat $300 billion at the end of the war. In that sense, asset transfers and shifting the line is a zero-sum situation between Russia and Ukraine. One exactly offsets the other. In contrast, the US is relatively more interested in ending the war in any form as soon as possible compared to Ukraine, and thus prefers to maintain leverage rather than use it right now. Nevertheless, there are several ways around this problem. First, they could sell captured assets, raise money, and then purchase more weapons for Ukraine. This would narrow the location of the red line due to lost leverage, but would shift the line of expected outcome in the other direction, which, in turn, will shift the red line as well. Thus, the net effect remains uncertain. If weapons turn out to be the decisive factor in war, it is possible that the change in expected outcome more than compensates for the disappearance of costs. Of course, you might argue that the House bill provides for this money to be used to repair the damage from the Russian invasion. But remember that money is fungible. That is, if more money suddenly starts flowing to humanitarian causes, coalition partners and the Ukrainian government will get more money for boom-related expenses, not just finger guns. This is essentially the problem with sanctions, where humanitarian exemptions actually fund the military resources of the object of the sanctions, only in reverse. Second, it may be that war paradoxically becomes easier to resolve when one side has fewer costs. My academically rigorous alter ego personality has spent a lot of time researching this question, and she tells my not-so-academic version that the conditions for it don't exist right now, so we can go no further. If you really want to know how it works, we devoted an entire video to it last year. But for our current purposes, it's redundant. The final workaround isn't so much a solution as it is a compromise. Instead of touching the $300 billion principle, I'll give you some more time to think about it. Western countries will only withdraw the interest accrued on the funds invested. Again, with treasury bills now yielding about 5% per annum, even a very conservative investment strategy would yield about $15 billion per year. The reason this is not a complete solution is that with a full freeze, the interest would go back into the Russian account. Consequently, when the interest payments go to Ukraine, each year the war continues would mean a small reduction in the red line due to inflation. The $300 billion no longer buys as much as it used to. But there is good news. My books on the war are still priced under $300 billion. You've already seen examples on my channel, and I hope you'll check out one of them in more detail. There is more information in the video description. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Take care. By the way, the picture of Biden from the beginning of the video actually captures the moment when he was informed about the PMC Wagner mutiny almost a year ago. Funny how the what the heck expression on his face is almost identical to the one we all had at the time. Thank you very much for watching. Put likes, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for interesting news. All the best to you.